We can't sit and be waiting for some people from across the oceans to come and do it for us. It's not going to happen. And also, we must decolonize our minds and believe in ourselves. Because if your mind is decolonized, they don't need to come physically. You are already in prison.
In towns across Africa, the morning begins the same way it has for generations. A mother standing in line for imported flour, young men waiting for work that never comes, a marketplace filled with sunlight but short on locally made goods. And yet behind these ordinary scenes lies a contradiction so powerful, it forces us to ask, how can the richest continent in raw materials still be dependent on ships crossing the ocean just to feed itself? One African leader put it plainly, we can't sit and wait for people from across the oceans to come and do it for us. It's not going to happen. She wasn't talking about a political ideology. She was talking about something deeper, the battle for the African mind, the final frontier of colonization. Because once a people believe they cannot build, cannot feed themselves, cannot rise without outside help, no army needs to occupy their land. Their minds are already imprisoned. This idea strikes a chord, especially for those of you watching from the United States who remember a different era, an America that rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan, an America that once believed in industrial strength and local production. Today, as Africa struggles with imported food, exported raw materials, and the loss of its young generation to migration, one question grows louder than ever. What does real freedom look like if a nation cannot feed its own people? And even more boldly, who truly controls Africa if Africa does not control its own economy? Leaders like Thomas Sankara warned decades ago, who feeds you, controls you. That warning echoes today in the streets of Ouagadougou, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Kinshasa, and across a continent where 60% of the world's unused arable land sits under the same sun that shines more than 300 days a year. So today, I want to take you inside a story that is rarely told on American television, how Africans are fighting to decolonize not only their land, but their minds and their economy. From Ethiopia's people-funded Renaissance Dam to Burkina Faso's bold social reforms under leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré, to a rising youth generation refusing to wait for permission from the West. If you care about truth more than headlines, if you want to understand Africa as it really is, stay with me until the end. And please share this video if you believe economic freedom matters as much as political freedom. Across Africa, a powerful message is beginning to take root, one that challenges decades of dependency, foreign narratives, and the quiet psychological chains left behind by colonial rule. The message is simple but radical. Africa must decolonize its mind before it can rebuild its future. And that message echoed with unmistakable clarity in the speech that forms the heart of today's story. The speaker began with a truth too obvious to ignore, yet too uncomfortable for many leaders to admit. Africa is rich in everything the world needs to develop: land, sun, water, minerals, people. Yet Africa imports food. The contradiction is staggering. 60% of the world's unused fertile land is on the African continent. The region enjoys more than 300 days of sunshine each year, vast rivers, powerful rainfall cycles, and one of the fastest growing populations on Earth. And despite all of that, ships carrying wheat rice, sugar cooking oil, and even fruit arrive every day from Europe, Asia, and America. Why? The speaker did not hesitate, because Africa has been conditioned to believe it cannot survive without outside help. She gave examples that drew uncomfortable laughter in the room. Some Africans brag about owning furniture imported from Europe or the Middle East, while sitting in countries overflowing with timber-skilled carpenters and local artisans. Cotton grows abundantly, yet 90% of it is exported as raw fiber, only to be re-imported as expensive shirts, uniforms, and fabric. Cocoa farmers in West Africa produce beans worth $8 billion, but the global chocolate industry earns more than $100 billion from those same beans. The continent creates the raw wealth, someone else collects the finished profit. Her conclusion was blunt: exporting raw materials is the same as exporting jobs, exporting dignity, and exporting your future. The mining sector may employ workers, she said, but the high-paying jobs, the engineers, the chemical processors, the designers, the marketers, they all exist in the countries where the minerals are refined. Africa is left with the holes in the ground. Someone else gets the industry. But the speech went beyond economics. It challenged the continent to reclaim something far deeper: belief in its own capacity. And to illustrate that, she shared a story that surprised even the delegates listening. She spoke about Ethiopia, a nation that, despite poverty, internal challenges, and geopolitical pressure, built one of the continent's most ambitious projects, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. No Western investor came forward, no global bank offered the billions needed. Many African countries would have stopped right there, she said, still waiting for investors, still waiting for development, partners, still waiting for approval. But Ethiopia chose differently. The government asked its people for support, and millions answered. Every Ethiopian with a mobile phone began receiving text messages, sometimes once, twice, or 3 times a day. Each message allowed the recipient to donate $1 to the dam. Farmers contributed, civil servants contributed, taxi drivers contributed, the diaspora contributed millions. The result? The citizens, not foreign investors, funded the most important infrastructure project in modern Ethiopian history. They created the electricity they now enjoy because they believed in themselves. This was the first major lesson: a decolonized mind does not wait for permission to build. Then she recalled another example, the Ebola crisis. In a meeting at the United Nations, President Barack Obama warned that 1.44 million Africans could die if drastic action was not taken. The world did not respond with the urgency those numbers demanded. Money was delayed. International organizations made promises but delivered slowly. Many African leaders could have panicked, waited, or begged for help. Instead, they called for volunteers. More than 800 young Africans from different countries stepped forward. She interviewed some of them. One young Kenyan said, "What if this happened in my country and no one came?" Another said, "We always talk about Pan-Africanism. I thought this was how we show it in practice." These volunteers saved thousands of lives. In the end, fewer than 100,000 died, not the 1.44 million predicted. Her second lesson was just as powerful. When Africans act together, the continent is capable of miracles the world does not expect. Together, these stories exposed the central theme of her message. Africa does not lack land, talent, resources, or opportunity. What it lacks is the freedom to believe in its own strength and the courage to break habits of dependency that have lasted generations. The speech reached its emotional height when the conversation shifted from economics to people, women, young Africans, and ordinary citizens whose lives carry the weight of every political decision made by distant elites. If the earlier part of the address exposed the contradictions of Africa's wealth and dependency, this section delivered the human truth behind the continent's struggle. No revolution can stand if half the population is left behind. The climax began not with statistics, but with a simple observation that pierced through the room. You cannot walk on one leg and believe you can compete with those walking on two. She was speaking about women not as a moral talking point, but as the missing pillar of Africa's development. And then she revealed a piece of research that startled even seasoned policymakers in the chamber. Men, she said, typically spend about 30% of their income on their family. Women, in contrast, spend roughly 70% of their income on their family. If you empower a woman, you empower a household. If you empower many women, you stabilize a nation. She added another compelling fact: companies with more women in top management tend to perform better and are more competitive globally. In a continent where millions of small businesses, farms, and trading networks are already run by women, the logic becomes undeniable. Africa's rise depends on the women who already keep communities alive. Then came the next shock. She described what she saw on a recent visit to Burkina Faso, a nation often portrayed in Western media as unstable, dangerous, or adrift. She made it clear she did not visit on the day of the coup, but she went soon after, invited to the launch of the Sankara Mausoleum, and what she saw changed her perception. Burkina Faso, she said, is experiencing a revolution. And I support progressive revolutions. For many in the room, this statement was provocative. Burkina Faso's government under President Ibrahim Traoré has been labeled controversial, rebellious, even anti-Western. But she did not speak about geopolitics. She focused on governance through a simple question: are leaders responding to the needs of their people? If the answer is yes, she argued that is good governance, regardless of the political structure. If the answer is no, no election or shiny constitution can fix the underlying crisis. Her praise for Burkina Faso was met with mixed reactions. Some nodded, recognizing the symbolic power of resurrecting the legacy of Thomas Sankara, the man who taught Africa to feed itself, to empower women, to reject waste, and to refuse the humiliation of dependency. Others shifted in their seats, uneasy with the implication that traditional Western-style democracy may not be the only path to African stability. But she remained firm. Burkina is doing well because it is listening to its people. Just as the room was digesting that message, the emotional climax took a new turn thanks to the second speaker, Sarah Wanga, who represented civil society and free expression. She began by grounding everyone in a painful truth. It won't matter whether there is a new coup or a billion new elections. If people cannot speak, cannot question power, cannot access information. Her voice grew sharper as she listed the price Africa pays when civic space collapses. Militarization becomes the language of frustration. Conflict replaces dialogue. Distrust becomes the only currency between governments and their citizens. This was the moment the room fell into a heavy silence. Wanga reminded them that across the continent, from the streets of Nairobi to Madagascar to the deserts of the Sahel, young people are protesting not because they are idle or violent, but because they feel unheard, unseen, and excluded from decisions shaping their future. She warned that Africa's greatest danger is not coup, nor elections, nor foreign interference alone. It is the silencing of African voices. When civic space shrinks, justice vanishes. When journalists are targeted, corruption thrives. When governments treat criticism as hostility, they create the very instability they fear. And then she asked the most uncomfortable question of all: would you be here if you were not being paid to be here? She challenged every official in the room to examine their own conscience, not their titles. In that instant, it became clear why this segment of the event represented the true climax. The earlier economic arguments were sharp, the statistics were strong, but this was personal, moral, unavoidably human. The reactions in the room were a mixture of admiration, tension, and contemplation. Some leaders applauded, others hesitated. But no one could dismiss the truth: Africa's fight for dignity cannot succeed unless its people, women, youth, citizens, are allowed to reclaim their power. This was not just a speech anymore. It was a challenge, a line in the sand, a call for Africa to rediscover its voice. As the speeches unfolded, the implications of everything said about dependency, women, youth, silence, and African self-belief became impossible to ignore. Beneath the inspirational examples lay a sobering truth: Africa is standing at a crossroads, and the decisions made now will shape not only political outcomes, but the daily lives of millions. The civil and political consequences of failing or succeeding in this continental awakening are profound. The first consequence centers on trust, the fragile contract between governments and citizens. Across Africa, trust has been eroded by decades of unmet promises, corruption, mismanagement, and leadership that often catered more to foreign creditors than to local communities. When the speaker said that good governance means responding to the needs of the population, she pointed directly at this broken contract. If governments ignore their people, she warned, instability becomes inevitable. Not because Africans are prone to coups, as some foreign analysts claim, but because people will always rebel when they feel abandoned. This breakdown of trust explains why protests erupt so quickly, why young people risk their lives crossing the Sahara Desert, and why entire communities feel alienated from national decision-making. When citizens cannot ask questions, cannot access information, cannot influence their leaders, the nation begins living on borrowed time. Sarah Wanga's words, militarization becomes the language of unresolved justice, captured this phenomenon perfectly. In the absence of dialogue, conflict becomes the only remaining tool. The second major consequence is the widening civil inclusion gap, especially for women and youth. The first speaker warned that no society can walk on one leg yet. That is exactly what many African nations are attempting to do. Women who stabilize families and communities remain underrepresented in politics and severely underfunded in business. Youth, who make up more than 60% of the population, are often treated as a threat rather than an asset. The result is predictable frustration, unemployment, migration, and a growing sense of powerlessness. Politically, this creates a dangerous paradox. Many governments depend on the labor, creativity, and votes of young people, but rarely include them in policymaking. At the same time, women remain burdened with unpaid care work while being excluded from economic decisions that directly affect their survival. When these groups feel invisible, the entire democratic structure becomes hollow. Elections continue, parliaments meet, policies are drafted, but none of it touches the real heartbeat of society. The third consequence that emerged from the speeches concerns Africa's stalled regional agreements, protocols that exist on paper but remain lifeless in practice. The speaker cited the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, the Pan-African Payment System, the Protocol on Free Movement of People, and the Convention on Eliminating Gender-Based Violence. These agreements were meant to transform the continent, but many member states simply refuse to implement them. Without free movement, families remain divided, traders struggle, and young workers see no opportunities. Without regional payment systems, countries remain chained to the US dollar for intra-African trade. Without the Violence Convention, millions of women continue suffering in silence. Politically, the failure to implement these agreements signals something deeper, a leadership crisis not of capacity but of courage. Leaders sign bold declarations in Addis Ababa clap for ambitious continental agendas and then return home to maintain the status quo. This gap between vision and action, between continental ambition and local political will, is one of Africa's greatest obstacles. The final consequence ties everything together: migration and the loss of human potential. When young Africans feel they have no future at home, they embark on perilous journeys across the Sahara and Mediterranean. Many die, many disappear, many never regain the confidence or stability to rebuild their lives. The speaker reminded the audience that these tragedies are not accidents. They are the result of economies failing to industrialize governments, failing to create jobs and societies, failing to develop the skills revolution needed for the modern world. The message was clear. If Africa continues to ignore its people, it will lose them. But if it listens, truly listens, it can unlock one of the greatest reservoirs of talent and resilience on Earth. To fully understand the significance of these speeches, we must step outside the walls of the Pan-African Parliament and examine how the rest of the world, especially the United States, views Africa's new push for self-determination. Because whether Americans realize it or not, what happens in Africa is no longer a distant regional issue. It is becoming one of the defining geopolitical questions of the century. For decades, U.S. foreign policy toward Africa has followed a familiar pattern: humanitarian aid, counterterrorism partnerships, military training, and economic programs often tied to American interests. Many of these initiatives brought real benefits, but they also created an unintended dependency. Washington became accustomed to an Africa that asked for support, not an Africa that demanded equality. So when African leaders begin saying, "We will not wait for the West," "We will do this ourselves," it disrupts old assumptions. The Ethiopia Renaissance Dam is a perfect example. When Ethiopia funded its own dam with citizen donations $1 at a time, it sent a message that resonated far beyond the continent. Africa is no longer waiting for outside approval. Western governments, including the United States, struggled to understand this shift because it signaled a break from the era of Western-led development. Ethiopia was not asking for loans, grants, or oversight. It was asserting the right to define its own destiny. This trend is now emerging elsewhere, from Burkina Faso's sovereignty-centered reforms under President Ibrahim Traoré to new regional alliances in the Sahel that openly challenge French and American influence. For Washington, which built much of its Africa policy on stability partnerships, these developments create both uncertainty and opportunity. On one hand, U.S. policymakers fear losing strategic influence in a region important for counterterrorism, trade, and geopolitical balance. On the other hand, a more self-sufficient Africa could become a stronger, more reliable global partner if the U.S. chooses engagement over intimidation. Meanwhile, the international community remains divided. European governments, long accustomed to preferential access to African minerals and markets, worry about losing economic leverage. International financial institutions, the IMF and World Bank, are uneasy about African countries seeking development paths outside their frameworks. China and Russia see Africa's awakening as a chance to deepen their own influence, offering infrastructure and military partnerships without the political conditions Western countries often impose. Yet, the speakers at the parliament were not advocating alignment with China or Russia, nor a rejection of America. Their message was far more nuanced. Africa wants partnership, not guardianship. Respect, not lectures. Cooperation, not dependency. This is a message the United States must take seriously if it hopes to remain a credible ally in the 21st century. The speeches also exposed a moral contradiction in global politics. Western governments acknowledged in conferences from Abuja in 1993 to Durban in 2001 that slavery and colonial exploitation were crimes against humanity. They recognized the historic and economic debt owed to Africans and people of African descent. And yet reparations remain largely symbolic statements without action, apologies without transformation. Many Americans, especially older generations who lived through the civil rights era, understand how long justice can be delayed, even when universally acknowledged. For these viewers, Africa's push for reparative justice might feel familiar. It mirrors the same struggle for dignity repair and recognition that shaped American history throughout the 20th century. And the speakers were clear: reparations are not charity, but a moral and legal imperative to correct centuries of extraction that enriched the West while impoverishing Africa. The global reaction to Africa's awakening will shape the future. If the U.S. embraces genuine partnership supporting African industrialization, regional integration, and political inclusion, it may help build a more stable and prosperous world. But if Washington responds with suspicion sanctions or attempts to maintain old structures of influence, it risks alienating a continent that will soon represent half the world's youth. In short, Africa is changing, and the world must decide whether to change with it. As the final words of the speeches lingered in the air, a quiet realization settled over the room. Africa is no longer asking the world for permission to rise. It is asking its own people, women, youth workers, farmers, students, to step forward, reclaim their voice, and shape a future defined not by dependency, but by dignity. And yet beneath this sense of awakening lies a warning the world cannot afford to ignore. If Africa fails to act on the truths spoken in that chamber, if it continues exporting raw wealth, silencing its youth, excluding its women, and waiting for foreign investors to solve its problems, the consequences will spread far beyond the continent. Protests will grow, distrust will deepen, migration will accelerate, conflict will harden, and a generation of brilliant young Africans will look outward instead of building at home. This is not just Africa's challenge, it is a global one. For American viewers, especially those who have lived through sweeping eras of change from the civil rights movement to the Cold War to the rise of Asia, this moment may feel familiar. Every great nation, every rising region reaches a point where it must confront uncomfortable truths. Who are we? Who do we want to be? Who truly benefits from our labor, our talent, our land, our future? Africa is standing at that threshold now. And the leaders who spoke along with activists like Sarah Wanga are urging the continent to choose courage over comfort, action over dependence, unity over fragmentation. They reminded their audience that no amount of foreign aid or foreign military presence can substitute for governments that listen to their people, economies that create jobs, or societies that treat women and youth as full participants in national life. The warning is clear. If Africa does not raise its voice, others will continue speaking for it. If Africa does not define justice, others will decide what is fair. If Africa does not control its economy, others will continue to control its destiny. But there is hope, real, tangible hope in the examples already emerging. Ethiopia's people-funded dam, Burkina Faso's social reforms under figures like President Ibrahim Traoré, regional movements demanding accountability, women's conferences, shaping policy, young activists courageously defending civic space. These are not symbolic gestures. They are the first signs of a continent rediscovering its agency. And as global power shifts toward a future where Africa's population will represent half the world's youth, Americans must ask themselves, will the United States relate to Africa as a partner or cling to outdated hierarchies? Will it support Africans who are fighting to decolonize their economies or remain tied to old systems that breed resentment and instability? The answer matters not just for Africans, but for the world your grandchildren will inherit. So I leave you with two questions. Do you believe Africa's next chapter should be written by the people who live there? And do you believe leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré are charting a path worth supporting? Or should someone else take up that mantle? If you care about real Africa news, not the filtered headlines, then stay engaged. If you feel you are among the first to understand these deeper shifts in Burkina Faso, Mali, Ethiopia, and across the continent, please share this video. And subscribe if you believe that truth and dignity must always outweigh convenience and silence.